recording in progress. Great. So welcome to this panel on international employment relations. It's the first part, I think, of two panels, part A, the program says, and this is LERA best papers. So we have distinguished papers that are being presented today. Starting off with Lorenzo and Tingting. Lorenzo is an associate professor at the university, I looked this up. Do you want to tell me, it's this acronym, ESG-UQAM in Montreal.
Yeah, is a School of Management at the University of Québec in Montreal. École des sciences de la gestion, Université de Québec à Montréal.
So he is very distinguished, published lots of articles in BGIR and other journals, and he was the chair of the 8.5 LERA Conference of the Americas last year. And the other presenter is Tingting Zeng, who used to be or is still at Merrimack College, but is an incoming assistant professor at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And so Lorenzo has worked on unionism, institutions, work and society, lots of topics. Tingting focuses more on training and development, seems at least from the bio a little bit more narrow, focused, deep on one area. I don't know, whichever way you want to frame it. Anyway, she's also highly published in journals such as the International Migration Review, BGIR, and others. And the floor is yours. Here you go.
Thank you. Can you see the slides? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for this nice presentation. And what we are presenting now is a slightly different title, but it's the same content. So Global Union Federation on Affiliates Websites, Forces Shaping Unions' Global Organizational Identity. When you speak about, there is a big stream, there is a big debate about union identity. What is union identity? Basically, is the definition or the answer, or who are we as a union and what do we stand for? Union identity has been analyzed by Hyman. If you look on the right side, the typical triangle, so union identity is between class, market, and society. Union has been classified based on their values, ideologies, goals. On the internal functioning, the kind of is a democratic, is top-down, bottom-up. In terms of interest representation, is a trade union, is a sector union, is a union, comprehensive union. And especially about membership attachment, what are the kind of identity aspects that union try to shape to attract and retain more members. There is one dimension, though, of these that has not been yet studied, that is the global dimension of union identity. This aspect has been triggered especially by globalization dynamics. More and more unions are pushed to move beyond their traditional local and national scope. They are organized, they organize many international alliances. They try to size the global space to affect multinational corporations and improve labor rights around the world. And Global Union Federation has become more and more a prominent actor of in industrial relations, especially on the global level. So Global Union Federation, they face two challenges in their become one, ability to become one. So first one is there is a multitude of affiliates around the world with different cultures and different values. The second aspect is Global Union Federation are one step removed from the membership because they are Global Union Federation, who are federation of organizations, and then there are the affiliates with their members. What we do, we study, our evidence are based on a union website, the extent to which Global Union Federation affiliates, they trace their profile and their identity, especially as a global union, as being part of a global union. So what are the three mechanisms that shape union identity? So first and foremost, especially in terms of global union identity, first and foremost are values. So values are at the base of the identity, and especially the typical workers of the world unite, they shape internationalism of unions for many decades. The second aspect is attractiveness. So unions try to shape their identity and to push one aspect or the other more of their identity if this aspect is able to attract and retain more members. And finally, identity depends on relationship. Organizations who are in relationship with other stakeholders, they are able to maybe shape more their identity toward that stakeholder and make this component more silent than others.
So in this particular project, we did this, what we call the sequential mixed method approach. The first step, we did the website content analysis, try to understand, how do we measure this organizational identity across different countries, across different organizations, across different unions. And the second step, we did the regression analysis to understand what's the kind of an antecedent or predictors to really understand how do we evaluate different kind of like union organizational identities and across their kind of like a different platform. The third step, we did the semi-structured interviews to really understand how and why we observe those heterogeneities across different organizations. So here we show you kind of a little bit like the things we have done. The first step, we constructed this what we call the Global Union Federation Saliency Index across different websites. And we used the confirmatory factor analysis to identify those factors, and then we impose different weights. And on the right side, you see the table that the 4 different global union federations and their mean kind of a global saliency index and the standard deviation. And you can see there's a huge variation in terms of how salient the Global Union Federation being present on the affiliated union's website. And the second step in our regression analysis, we did 2 kind of separate analysis. The first one, we estimated the probability for the affiliate to have a website, right? And we find that this kind of probability or prevalence of using website to demonstrate the union activities is closely related to the kind of country-specific factors. We measure the economic factors using the GDP per capita, and we also use the kind of audience measures by the internet coverage. We also measure their kind of like industrial relations environment by using the union density and the labor violation. Unfortunately, that's the only kind of factors that we were able to collect across more than 180 countries globally. So that's kind of the part of the limitation. And when we study the relationship between those indicators and our global federation kind of like saliency index, we find the country-specific kind of like characteristics no longer explain whether they decide to present the Global Union Federation on their own organizational website. Instead, specific type of Global Union Federation seems to explain the majority of the variation in terms of whether the local affiliate decide to kind of like show their relationship with the groups on their website or not. And the third step, we really try to understand why, right? Like Lorenzo alluded in his kind of theoretical discussion that we want to focus on the values, attractiveness, and relationship, these 3 kind of pillars in terms of the organizational level decision-making, in terms of how, why specific union want to demonstrate their kind of relationship and the connections with the Global Union Federation. So we did in-depth kind of interviews using different languages and across different countries and try to understand this why and why they make such a decision.
So as Tingting mentioned, if we look at this big picture, the extent to which an affiliate put on its website material that clearly links them to the Global Union Federation they belong to. So it's not a matter of institutional characteristics, it's mostly a matter of organizational level force. So each union, each affiliate, when they have a website, then the content of the website depends on specific organizational forces. If you look overall, there is so much variation in this global saliency index that we can say that the micro foundation of Global Union Federation, global power, appears fragmented from this perspective. More importantly, we see that values, especially through our interviews, and so the old slogan, workers of the world unite, and being left is they don't have a real effect on the extent to which affiliates they post material about Global Union Federation on their website. Instead, attraction is really important. So we found that affiliates who have, for example, a very ethnic diverse membership or very young and educated, they use Global Union Federation material. They include in their website because it's this kind of material that attracts and interests members. We look at relationships. Relationships are very important, and these go in two different opposite forces. We have a countering relationships. So unions, affiliates that are really struggling at the local level with the high competition with other unions, they don't care too much about Global Union Federations. Other affiliates, they have access to alternative networks, so they can go directly to the island skipping the Global Union Federation, or they're part of other international networks. But most important, are favoring relationships. So the relationship between the Global Union Federation and affiliates who has been part of special project, or have been, and then who found, affiliates who found the specific bargaining resources and capacitation through PSI, and especially who have strong personal links. All of these kind of aspects, they push these affiliates to include much more material about the Global Union Federation in their website. Clearly, when we found that the highest ranking when attraction and relationship, they work together. So what are the implications for the Global Union Federation? Policies and the special communication policies. So Global Union Federation, they should be able to do detailed investigation on affiliates' targeted audience and their characteristics to provide them with some specific material that can attract them. So in this way, they will be able to have a link that goes from the Global Union Federation to the affiliates and down to the members. As well as being able to strategically map the kind of resources that each affiliate needs the most. This is a way to attract them and to then establish relationship with them. Thank you very much. We also put in other languages since it was done research in 5 languages. And I hope we have been in the 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Yeah, thank you so much, Lorenzo. You were wonderfully on time. And Idri also joined the panel now, so welcome Idri, and we have Ginny Dalgast who joined us here. So if somebody has particular questions, we can field them now. Otherwise, I would say we would talk about the papers at the end. So if there's not a burning question, or is there a burning question? Does somebody want to raise one? It doesn't mean anything about the paper. I just think that then we'll keep it like an interesting discussion together. So I would say that we pass then on the mic to Marissa and her research, and then we'll talk about the papers together at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning in California, so I don't know what time it is there, but hello. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Okay, can everybody see? Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the database that I've been building since 2015. The paper was a bit of a rush job in part because a lot of difficulties happened because of COVID-19, which slowed down the project. But I thought maybe I could introduce it to the group here and get some feedback on where to go next. So to give it a bit of a backdrop, my research has often centered on transnational campaigns, so workers' cooperation across national borders, where workers, unions, or other organized groups have tried to cooperate from at least 2 different countries in order to get a company to do something it otherwise wouldn't do. And often the target of these campaigns is an employer with some kind of transnational affiliation itself. And so since 2015, I've been building this database called the Transnational Labor Alliances Database Project. And we currently have over 155 folders in the database. And the folders contain information on these TLA campaigns spanning from the 1990s. Actually, I said late 1990s on the slide, from the early 1990s up until the present. Basically what it is an archive of primary and secondary sources where the research assistants, and I've had over 150 RAs trained on the project since it started. They keep coming and going. They're mostly undergraduate students who are basically collecting every piece of information they could find on each of these campaigns. So they would receive an assignment, and then they would essentially go look for newspaper articles, websites, corporate statements, documents from OECD reports, anything they could find, YouTube videos. They're now going on social media, looking at Twitter, looking at the Facebook pages, anything to find the paper trail of what happened in these campaigns, whether the campaign succeeded or failed. And they're not only creating an archive, they're also essentially reading every source that they collect. So for each folder, it could be, it could be 50 sources, it could be 150 sources. They read all of those, and then filling out a template, they report in chronological order everything that they know that happened in the campaign. So essentially what this is a large and qualitative database. It's not a data set. They're not coding these things into numbers for quantitative analysis, though they could. I realize I've got these screenshots here, but we're on Zoom, so I can actually just show you the actual database. So let me just go ahead and Google Chrome. So here's the actual database. It's in this Google Drive. And like I said, you can see the different sources or the different folders sorted by name. We keep adding campaigns as we learn about ones that have happened. So normally through my other field work or interviews or just anecdotally, or I read someone mentions a case in a published scholarly article, or I happen upon something online, or I'm on a global union website, I learn about an international campaign that fits our scope conditions, add it to the database. And so you can see, each folder. So IKEA, for instance, added a little while ago. This was an incident that took place in a Rust Belt town in the United States, but it dealt with the company IKEA in Europe. European unions and workers assisted the American workers in getting higher pay, less discrimination, and so forth. And so you can see we date code the documents. Sometimes they're in other languages. Sometimes it's YouTube videos. Sometimes it's MP3 clips. Sometimes it's, a photo of a protest or something that happened. And this is everything that we could find that's publicly available for each case. So again, it's an archive of primary and secondary sources, but it's also a set of timelines, right? And so the timelines, you can see, I don't know if you can see this, the project completion list, anything in the purple column is finished. So we have 69 out of 155 finalized timelines that are as complete as far as we can tell, other than obvious gaps, and I'll get to the methodological flaws in a second. We have 17 almost finished, meaning they have a first and second timeline. We do 2 timelines per case for an intercoder reliability check. And then almost 30 have almost just 1 complete timeline. So this is the spreadsheet. This is our sort of works in progress. Like I said, the database is housed here in the Google Drive. If I were to click on, Coca-Cola Guatemala, you would not only see everything, that we could find, LexisNexis, Google Scholar, or we just searched everything on the internet. Sometimes there's interview data in there, but not often. And then if you want to see, okay, what happened in the Coca-Cola Guatemala campaign, you can open up the final timeline for it. By the way, I don't know what happened in this campaign. I don't remember. There's over 100 cases, but just to show you the template. So all of the timelines show you the name of the campaign, the employer involved, information about the subsidiary. So it might not just be Coca-Cola, but it might be this particular, could be bottling plant or something like that. Which of the global unions were involved? In this case, it was the IUF. Which unions and workers played a major role in the campaign, and then who maybe played a supporting or minor role? Where are they from? What are their acronyms? Other supporters, what was the reason for the campaign? So they list the issue and the dispute. And then general overview of the dates. So you could know, was it 6 months? Was it 5 years? A general overview of the outcomes. Instead of saying success or failure, we quote unquote code them in terms of, was it a gain or a loss? What in particular did the workers gain or lose? And then a complete timeline of all the actions, they're distilling from all of these, primary and secondary sources that they've collected for the archive, and essentially giving you a rundown of the campaign. So getting back to my delicious PowerPoint. Right, so that's essentially what the RAs have been doing. They're creating these templates, and they're basically, together we've created about 70 complete cases. What I want to talk about while I have my remaining time are challenges in data collection. I was hoping to get some feedback on how to improve the database and also what to do with it, and then a really brief overview of findings. So maybe if Toby will generously give me 30 more seconds past my time, I can do that. But you know, one of the main challenges we've always had has been a reliance on publicly available information. And, you know, you can only do so many interviews before you annoy all the people who are involved in these campaigns. But, you know, I would want to know, how bad are the gaps, right? How inaccurate are some of our case study skeletons? Because they're just skeletons, right? If you were to take one of those timeline sheets, you wouldn't really write an article based off of just that. You would want to fill it in. But just trying to get feedback from experts, I would be curious, someone involved in a campaign, to read some of our templates. And actually, we've done this with Make Amazon Pay, which is an ongoing campaign. I'm in contact with a bunch of people who are currently working on this global Amazon campaign, and they're providing data for us, but also we're also now collecting data for them. There's a huge underrepresentation of failure cases, in part because unions and global unions don't like to talk about failures. They'll come up anecdotally during an interview, or, you know, maybe mentioned in a book chapter or something, but really to have to do the digging, a lot of the information sometimes disappears from the internet. So we have to use Wayback Machine or a Google cache page in order to find things. But those are going to be the most important cases in order to learn something about broad trends and to avoid the problem of survivorship bias. We also tend to rely predominantly on English language sources. So, you know, most of my RAs speak English as a first language. A lot of them speak Spanish as a first language as well. But and we are at a very diverse university, but it's still, you know, as you notice, a lot of the cases in my database come from English language speaking countries, or at least involve at least one English speaking actor. And I'm just wondering how much that's going to skew our overall results. Staying up to date has been a challenge. So in part because of, you know, switching to online teaching and all the chaos of 2020, some of the project was put on ice, and I recently revived it, retrained a bunch of RAs, which I could not do in person. So this is, you know, it's been a little bit frozen for a while, and just now getting back to it. How to stay up to date? Do we just keep monitoring the websites of the global unions? Do we need people in constant contact? How useful is this for practitioners, not just academics? And then, of course, there are conceptual definition problems where people don't always agree. And so that is challenging for eventually, again, even coding into a qualitative sort of template. Just because we're running low on time, just to briefly talk about some of the findings. So now that we've had quite a lot of cases finalized in terms of what we can do from desk work, you know, we're getting a sense that obviously the methodological biases are biasing these results, but we're also getting an interesting sense of trends over time. You know, the countries and regions affected, initially, the cases from the 90s and 2000s focus a lot on Europe and the United States, and then a few developing countries. More and more, it's trending toward developing countries, but interestingly, still democracies. Some authoritarian countries, I mean, particularly China, is coming up more than ever in the 2010s. And then it's, you know, we don't have any cases in 2020. So that's been interesting, but most cases still take place in the democratic countries. Again, of the, you know, again, nearly 70 that we have finalized, they almost all connect to some kind of global, I don't know if you prefer global supply chain, global value chain, GPN, but that's maybe not surprising. And a lot of the cases don't target directly the headquarter company. I mean, it's always a problem often with a subsidiary, right? Or a supplier that's not owned or controlled by the company. And there is some evidence that, not surprisingly, direct ownership is more likely to lead to a successful campaign than these arm's length supplier types of relationships where it's, you know, it's not FDI, it's really a separate company supplying. The home countries of the companies, so the countries and regions of the unions has been trending toward developing countries, And same thing with the TNCs that are targeted, the employers targeted. Early cases were a lot of European companies. And while they are still represented in the database, you're seeing a lot more cases from developing countries. In China, we have Foxconn and Yuyan and JASIC, for example. So again, a lot of, not just China, but a lot of developing country headquartered companies are appearing more when you get to the 2010s. The diversity of industries grows over time. So initially it was a lot of manufacturing or automobiles, garments, and then moving on to the service sector, increasingly food and beverages, and there was always logistics and transport, but you see more hotels, more retail, newer industries, also tech industries, for example, there's Google File, there's an Amazon File. And then the strategies have always been really quite diverse in terms of the representation in the database, as has the type of unions or workers involved. So that's it for, I think I'm at 12 minutes. Thank you for your time. I will stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Marissa. And I just realized that I forgot to introduce you. You're more familiar to me, so I guess I didn't check that. So Marissa is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, and she's also affiliated with the Labor Studies program there. Some of the research that led to the creation of this database is published in articles and comparative political studies and others, but also her book with Cornell Press on the new politics of transnational labor, why some alliances succeed. I'm really impressed by the two papers so far in terms of their really globally spanning breadth and the depth of qualitative research. So we will now return to Lorenzo and Tingting. They have a second paper that they're presenting. This second paper was co-authored or has been co-authored with Jack Fiorito from Florida State University in Tallahassee. Jack is at a different panel right now, so he can't join us. The floor is back to Lorenzo and Tingting.
Thank you. Okay, can you see the screen? Okay, so now we reduce the international and transnational span to 2 countries. So more blurred border than expected, general attitudes and specific union voting intention in US and Canada. So when we look at the 2 different trajectories of unionism in Canada and US, we have a lot of debate. So this debate has been especially developed around 2 different perspectives. One is the institutional. So this gap in trends is explained by a difference in the labor law development that is much more pro-union in Canada and much less in the US. On the supply side, so business unionism in the US, whereas in Canada is much more a social unionism model-like, and corporation has been fiercely anti-union in the US while more accommodating in Canada. Though recently we have a couple of evidence that they are kind of putting this perspective under question, because unions in US have been much more involved in social movement unionism, so more going toward a social unionism model, and Canadian corporations are becoming more aggressive in union opposition. When we go into the cultural, so this is the demand side, why people they are demanding for a union. This is the explanation by Lipset and colleagues. So they saw that the general attitudes toward unions, so if we ask people if they support unions or not in general, is very similar between US and Canada. However, we find that American general support is based more on instrumental beliefs, meaning that people, they want to have higher wages, better working conditions, whereas in Canada is more based on pro-social beliefs, meaning that Canadians, they see the unions as a social institution that can bring something good for the society in general, not just for myself. So how Lipset explained why in US we have this gap in between these general attitudes, pretty high general attitudes toward unions, and the specific then outcome, people, when they have to vote for unions, they don't vote in favor of unions of the time. The difference is between, because we have this general definition of unions, but then when push comes to shove and the individual American worker has to vote, there there are specific situational dynamics that are much more important than the general attitudes, and the individualism of the workers come out and they vote to no finally at the union body. So what we look at more specifically, our first dependent variable is general attitudes toward unions. So we have the debate how in US has been characterized by possessive individualism, laissez-faire values, whereas Canadian are more social-democratic and collectivist traditions. And as mentioned before, we have similar level of general union attitudes, but different mechanisms to explain them. Though, if we look within the US case, really recently, the general attitudes toward unions has been more motivated, more explained by pro-social basis than instrumental ones in the US. What we expect to find more or less the same picture. So Canada more pro-social, US more instrumental, and within US that the pro-social became more important than instrumental. When we move from the general attitude to the specific voting intention, we expect that both union general attitudes and specific situational beliefs in which one person is embedded when has to vote are important. Second, when we come to the relevance of general attitudes versus situational beliefs, which one is more important, we expect that in Canada, general attitudes are more important because they are based on more pro-social values, and these are more resilient to external and situational dynamics. And finally, if we look just at the two situational beliefs, we expect, as we said before, that Americans are much more reactive to instrumental beliefs in that specific situation, whereas Canadians to more pro-social situational beliefs.
So in this project, we distributed close to 6,000 surveys in both countries in the official language in both countries, targeted workers 18 years older. Here we listed some major kind of like items that we asked during the question during the survey, and we collected the individual characteristics of those participants as well. Next slide, please. The first step, we try to understand the relationship between the instrumental beliefs and the general union attitude across both countries. And when we did the kind of within country analysis, you can see that both instrumental beliefs and the pro-social beliefs are positive related to positive general union attitude. And when we do the whole country kind of analysis, clearly for Americans, they are more kind of leaning towards the instrumental beliefs, and Canadian kind of like leaning more towards the pro-social beliefs. The next step, we try to really kind of probe the situational kind of like pro-social and the instrumental cues using this experimental Venn methodology. In our survey, we actually created this hypothetical scenarios that a hypothetical union voting situation, not for the subjects themselves, but for like, a hypothetical figure that we call Chris. We kind of give them information about the positive versus negative kind of situations and ask them whether Chris wanted to vote yes for a potentially kind of union certification. And here, that's the kind of visualization of our first set of findings, right? Between US and Canada, along the scale of general attitude towards union, like the voting intention actually quite similar between these two countries. Next slide, please. And we run the regression analysis to really kind of test the second kind of like a set of hypotheses, right? The relationship between general attitude and voting intention, also the relationship between the veneer cues, the instrumental and the pro-social cues, and towards the union intention as well. We find all three kind of factors, the general attitude, the kind of prod of venient pro-social cues and the venient instrumental cues, both have a negative, both have a positive impact on the potential voting kind of like a positive voting intentions towards a union in both US and Canada. And when we do the poll kind of between country analysis, what we find is we didn't find any much of a difference, or at least statistical kind of like a difference in terms of like, whether these two countries will behave differently in terms of whether they want to vote for the union or not.
So if we go back to Lipset cultural theory and value difference theory, we confirm that there is a difference in values when we speak about the general attitudes toward unions, and actually Canadians are more pro-social driven and US much more instrumentally driven. But we have to qualify this. When you speak about general attitudes toward unions, within US, pro-social beliefs count more than instrumental right now. At the same time, our results, they deeply challenge the Lipset and colleague point of view, because yes, it's true that there is a gap between the general attitudes and voting intention in a specific situation, but this is not true also for US, but also for Canada, just for US, but also for Canada. So specific voting intention are similar on both sides, slightly more defined by instrumental situational beliefs. And union general attitudes, they count, but not that much on both sides of the border. So overall, we want to be a little bit more critical towards the overly narrated binary simplification of collective versus instrumental unionism in Canada and the US to explain the difference in the trend of union density and the final outcome of union voting. This, at the same time, will shed light on the relevance of institutional approach, and especially on labor law and especially union certification. And at the same time, shows how most of the workers on both sides of the border, they're very sensitive to situational instrumental beliefs. So union, if they want to really shape the outcome of a vote, they should be able to have effective organizing campaign that leverage several in-person or live communication challenge to affect the situational beliefs around the specific voting, union voting certification. Thank you. I hope we were within the 10 minutes.
You were perfect. So thank you so much, Lorenzo and Tingting. So we move on to our final paper by, and I don't want to mispronounce the name, but it's Yiluyi Zeng, or going by Idri, I believe. Yeah, so I go with Idri. So Idri is finishing her PhD, I believe, at the University of Warwick, and she, before the PhD in Warwick, she got a master's degree at Illinois, where Tingting is moving in a few weeks. So there are some connections here. Idri focuses on flexible employment, meaningfulness, labor process, contracting behaviors, and cross-cultural comparisons. And Idri shared with us a pre-recorded version of her talk, and I'm just going to play this.
You a live presentation.
If you don't want live, that's fine. If you want to do live, that's fine too. Yeah. Okay, go with live then.
Okay, I need to share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. PowerPoint. Share. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. So yeah, the paper I'm presenting today is about how skilled freelancers perceive exploitation. So usually exploitation is structural, it's out there. But this presentation, I explore how do freelancers perceive their work is exploitative or fair. So about skilled freelancing, I think many of you are familiar that there are two different views. One is that, it's flexible, it's autonomous. The other view is that freelancing has weakened workers' bargaining power, especially when they move to online platforms. So when especially the industrial relation scholars, when they talk about freelance or freelance work, they use exploitation, and sometimes they think that freelance is self-exploit too. So in the next slides, I will present those arguments and justify why I choose to study subjective assessment of exploitation. So the exploitation argument suggests that freelancers are exploited by capital. So through industrial or organizational restructuring, employers can shift cost, can shift risk to individual workers. And now they can also select workers from a large pool of freelancers all over the world with various experience and expertise, making it very difficult for freelancers to raise their prices. However, there are two problems in the exploitation argument. One problem is not unique to freelancing, but it's more of a general counter-argument to exploitation by Kaufman. Kaufman argues that capitalists also add value to the valorization of labor. Profits are monetary rewards for capitalists. The second problem is that the relationship between freelancers and clients approximate the relationship between sellers and buyers in the market. Not all clients are organizations. Sometimes freelancers trade with individuals who just want to get the certificate translated. So does the exploitation framework applies then? So that's the two problems with the exploitation argument. In terms of the self-exploitation, freelancers, if freelancers self-exploit, that means freelancers take two identities. They are entrepreneur, they want to have a successful business and they want to increase income. But as a laborer, so the first identity is entrepreneur, the second identity is a laborer. They overwork, to extend that they have to sacrifice their well-being to improve their reputation in the labor market. The problem with this is that many studies found that it is not an alienating experience for freelancers. It's labor's love, they have passions for their work, so they chose to overwork sometimes. So I think that the problem here is that the self-exploitation argument contains two levels of analysis. Of course, it's similar to exploitation framework in that freelancers take the responsibility, take the risk that employers would. But it is an individual analysis that freelancers make sense of their work. They say this is my passion. So it's structural as well as subjective frameworks combined in one. So my goal is here to explore, not to reject the structural framework, but to explore how freelancers assess exploitation. So to answer this research question, I interviewed skilled freelancers in England and Taiwan. I interview people from different professions because the purpose is to understand freelance work in general. And I will share 3 findings here. The first finding, sorry, probably I blocked mine, sorry. Okay, so the first finding is that when freelancers think that they get compensated for their labor and time, and they get paid for the prices they ask for, then it's a fair exchange. It's not exploitative. Many of the new freelancers and experienced freelancers, they agree that in the early stage of freelancing, you can't ask for more because you have to accumulate experience, right? So for them, it's not exploitation. They have to do that. But many of them also know that over time, if you've done 3 or 4, you've accumulated experience, then it's not acceptable to be asked to lower your price. So they understand that, okay, I work to get more experience. That's a fair exchange, but they also have their own time frame when it is right time for me to accept higher pay. So if they get what they ask for, then it's a fair exchange. It's not exploitative. But when clients use their bargaining power to lower prices, then freelancers think clients get more value out of the work. So for instance, there's a therapist, Amy, in my study. She usually charges £50 per session for her therapy. She has to reduce to £45, so £5 lower than her usual session. Although Amy's income has increased, but she felt that the trainee therapists get more. Sorry, I have to say that the £45 are for the trainee therapists because they are, let's say, 6 of them from one school. They have to get a supervisor in a way. So 6 of them can come together. So can you get us a lower price? Otherwise, we wouldn't choose you, right? So these trainee therapists are using their bargaining power to lower price, hourly rate. Even though Amy, she has increased her income in the next few months or a year, she still feels that just trainee therapists got more uncompensated value out of her work. So in that case, it's not a fair transaction, it's exploitative in her case. The second finding is when sometimes freelancers lower the price because clients' bargaining power. That's the first finding. The second finding is sometimes freelancers voluntarily lower their price, and that's fine because they think it's their moral obligation. When it is a moral obligation, when they feel like clients can benefit from having their service, especially when clients can't afford the service. So for instance, Philip, he is an experienced freelancer with 30 years of experience. He did consultation with artists. So he usually now he charges £200 to £500 per hour. But he once charged university students only £75 because he felt like it was the right thing to do. He could offer that support for young artists. So that's his moral obligations toward society. Not only high-paying freelancers do that, but also less financial stable freelancers also help clients in need. So what I'm trying to say that freelancers, they can judge the situation, they can sense whether clients can afford the service or not, whether or not they can benefit from their work. So in this case, it's not exploitative. Even they charge less than they normally would. The third finding is free work with long-term return. I think freelancers do free work. For example, they have to promote their work on social media. They have to learn new skills. For them, it's okay because how can you say this learning experience? For example, if I've been taking wedding photos, suddenly I want to take photos for films. I don't have that portfolio. If I suddenly say I want to have an experimental project, I take photos for a different purpose for films. How should I charge that? Does my learning work has market value? So for them, it's better to not to charge this, or they can do collaboration with other freelancers. So they don't think it's fair for them to charge clients. And many freelancers think that if they don't do it themselves for free, let's say maintaining a website, they have to hire somebody to do it. It costs money. So it is free work, but the alternative is paying somebody else. It's additional cost to them. So for them, this kind of free work is justifiable. It's not exploitative. And many freelancers confirm that, especially the experienced freelancers. They say those free work will pay off in the future. So it's fine. Overall, the perception of exploitation is difficult to quantify, but freelancers have their own assessment regarding whether a transaction or work is exploitative or not. When they voluntarily lower prices, or when it is supporting work to increase income in the future, then it's not exploitative. I think the takeaway here is that when we talk about exploitation, we assume that it's structural, which is fine. But when we talk about freelancers' work, it's that they self-exploit, they work long hours, but at the same time, we talk about how they like their work. I think it will be better for us to have meaningful discussion when we make the assumption explicit, which framework are we using? So yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Idri, for this fascinating look at freelancers and their self-perceptions of exploitation. So we had two more papers that did comparative work using two countries to address broad questions too. So we have about 9 minutes left, and I was wondering if the three listeners had questions. Otherwise, we can ask each other questions. Happy you could just speak, you could just raise your hand. We're a very small group, so I think that should work. Okay, go ahead, Judy.
Okay. I feel a lot more pressure in this session to ask a question. I've been turning my video off and just.
Well, the two other listeners did.
No, that was really interesting. It's too bad that there aren't more people in this session. I think probably one of the problems is that there are all these meetings going on during this particular session. And so those who are not actually in other sessions may be at those meetings. I really enjoyed all of the papers. And I would like to ask questions of all of them, but I think I'll just start off with a few maybe more focused questions. First of all, for Marissa, it's really nice to see the development of this project that I've now seen presented over many years, and to see where you're going with it now. And I thought it was really interesting how you pointed out that there was a shift from the labor alliances or the framework agreements that you were looking at, really moving from developed to developing country, or no longer being as focused on European countries. So I wonder if you could talk about how the tactics you're seeing of unions are changing as they're focusing on these developing country headquartered international firms, multinational firms. Is the leverage different? Particularly, you see in a lot of the historic case studies that European unions have played a central role in mobilizing within companies where they already had some strength. And so there was, I think, often that kind of split between also the European unions taking a lot of leadership in these campaigns, and in some cases not being as inclusive of unions in other countries as before. So I imagine this shift has some interesting implications for the power relationships between unions and sort of how they're working together. So I thought maybe you could speak to that. And then I had a question for Yiluyi and your paper. I thought your discussion of freelancers is interesting, particularly this relationship between the kind of structure of exploitation, or the way in which freelancers have their own assessment over whether the transaction is exploitative or not. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how you see this relationship between, on the one hand, the individual perception of exploitation and what some of the broader structural characteristics are. Because I know in some cases, there might be some false consciousness for workers, or perhaps another analysis is that it's not necessarily false consciousness. It's just that we're as researchers prioritizing what we think are these structures, where actually the workers know their situation better. So perhaps if you could unpack what you see as that relationship and your theorization of those trends.
Marissa, or can start, I guess, because the question was first for you, or
Sure.
and then Idri.
I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'll give a brief answer. Thank you, Ginny, by the way, and thank you to the audience for coming and watching these papers. So I thought the trends over the time, so the database is used for a number of projects now, but I was interested in these trends over time. And you're right, the strategies are shifting along with the emphasis on, there's still quite a lot of cases, I just want to emphasize, of the OECD countries, but there's more now with the developing countries. And I notice in terms of strategies, the sort of the older cases from the, say up through the 2000s, a lot of it was, what you'd expect. So like click and send email forms were very popular, court cases, email blitzes, right, the very 90s, shareholder votes, trying to attend the annual general meeting as shareholders and then having a protest vote, protest marches, appealing to government authorities, ILO complaints. And then as you shift to the late 2000s and really into the late 2010s, it's so much social media and internet focused. And so what would be a boycott or a naming and shaming campaign back then is now sort of this cancel culture, and in a good way, for, I suppose, in a useful way. But this is all speculative right now, but I'm wondering if just the ability of the internet to bring to the attention so quickly something happening in a developing country in a way that, you just couldn't even, it just wasn't even happening with, the mid 2000s. It was just such a different thing. It was very moveon.org. And now it's so quickly easy to spread something through TikTok, right? Or through, Instagram. So, that's more the trend. But the other thing I get, and just from talking to folks involved, is that there's so much that goes behind closed doors. And that's been the blockage. I got money to do field work. And of course, it's just been on ice, but there's still so much negotiation that goes on behind closed doors between union representatives, especially from prominent global unions, and then the companies. So, with some of the Coca-Cola cases in Pakistan or Guatemala, I know from the past that it's been the IUF going and talking to the management with whom they have a better relationship and saying, you've got to correct this issue in Pakistan, you've got to correct this issue in India, right? But I think, I guess the short answer to your question is it's a lot more social media, but it's still a lot of closed door conversations at higher levels. But you're seeing a lot less of the older tactics over time. Yeah, I don't remember if there was a second part to the question.
Maybe you can answer, if there was one, I don't recall it either, then you could answer it directly. So give the floor to
I shall cede the floor.
Thank you. Thanks, Virginia, for the question. I think I will give a very brief answer to your question. So regarding false consciousness, of course, many of them are not aware of this framework as freelancers, but even if some of them did say, they've already got money somewhere, even though they are conscious of structural exploitation, what can they do? Unless there's union or collective action, leading freelancers to raise their prices collectively, can they do that as an individual? But freelancers know what they can get away with in higher paying industries. They do charge for every minute they work. So I think it is about, yes, it is false consciousness. But even though when they are conscious, what can they do in that sense? Thank you.
So I'm going to take the prerogative as the chair to actually ask a question to Lorenzo and Tingting. So I thought your two papers were really interesting in terms of exploring how we think about the relationship of similarity and difference. The global paper, 180 countries. That's a lot of scope, and the US Canada comparison. It's of course a country comparison that is done a lot. But so as employment relations evolve, where do we focus conceptually in terms of conceptualizing difference and similarity? So I think that's a theme that comes out for me from your two papers. and you also use different methodologies, and you're quite reflected about it, just as Marissa is quite reflected about it. And so I'm wondering what your feelings are about the leverage that the different methodologies provide you in maybe innovating in how we think about similarity and difference. And particularly for the first paper, I mean, you emphasized that there seem to be organizational level of forces driving how global union federations are mentioned on unions' websites. And as a political scientist, I guess I wondered if we could refine that better, if we could maybe define ideal types among the 180 cases you're looking at. And you mentioned audience is important, and I was wondering if there are, certain countries maybe correlating with level of development or industry structure or whatever, where the websites focus on different audiences. Is it the workers in the country, or is it like global visitors? And so maybe there are kind of 4 ideal types in terms of what kind of communication is going on here. A union either communicating to its members that it has a global I don't know, foundation, or a union that wants to merely communicate to the international sphere that, they are. So I was just wondering in terms of, I mean, it's a very broad question, but like how you think about using different methodologies in terms of innovating similarity and difference and theorizing here.
You want to go, or I start?
Do you want to take this one, Lorenzo?
You can start.
Oh, okay. I just want to speak of the kind of like complexity and the methodology challenges that we see. Like first, I want to see Marissa, like your data set is amazing. Like as a data person, my eyes just wide open, super excited about the data collection you're doing. We're facing the same thing, right? Like we start by asking a question, and we quickly realize there's no way we can find secondary data. So we have to build something, start from scratch. And in this process, we realize, okay, we need to kind of even create our own measures and doing own stuff. Because like, we ask the question that in the past, nobody collected data and even like, think of collect data. But we now have the methodology, we have the capacity, we have a multimedia, we have different sorts of ways that we can collect data. So, it just takes a lot of labor effort to put things together. And maybe, in this process, we can find more insight. That's what we try to do here, because I think we try to answer a really important question in terms of what's the practical implication for the labor movement, especially across the country, right? Like, for the global supply chains, like, when you manage across, like, when you have corporations that can manage across countries, it's easy for them to kind of rally against the labor movement. But for the labor movement themselves, like with the fragmented cross kind of national boundary, even though we have the groups, but still their power and the ability to kind of consolidate power and bargaining collectively against those global supply chain corporations is really, really problematic at this point. We want to be able to find something that we can help the labor movement. That's just kind of like the motivation that we are doing here. Right, and we want to kind of like try to reconcile the different countries, different understanding, different political settings, and the different kind of organizing kind of strategies. And it's a challenging work, but I'm happy that we all like folks in this panel, like we all doing our bits and bytes, and we push the boundary bit by bit. So one step at a time.
Yeah, I mean, already Tingting answered pretty thoroughly to the question. I see that we go beyond the typical ideal types like unions from the north, unions from the south, etc., etc. But we go more into something that matters more. So unions that have this stronger global dimension, as we measure in terms of being showing that they are being active with the global union federation they belong to, based on mostly, let's say, relationship driven, or mostly based on attractiveness driven, or based on the two. And all what have been always the idea of internationalism values, some of the affiliates, they even have written in their constitution that internationalism is their goal. So they have to work for the workers of the world, etc., etc. But this actually becomes, let's say, a surface, but it doesn't go down in their action. So that's another interesting. So we can also see kind of different ideal ties between what they say in terms of values and then what they actually do on their website about internationalism. And what like Marissa really liked the presentation, and what she said, what is interesting in this kind of, we always said mono campaign analysis or mono, the challenge is to go across in this case and find forces that can link and show how these dynamics are developing longitudinally or across different countries with all the limitations that Marissa mentioned.
So I'm sorry, but we are out of time, and I see that Emily's on the call now too, so I think I take that as pressure to wrap up. Thank you everybody for participating, and I really enjoyed it, and we can stay in touch. We have email our emails, and so we can ask more questions and share comments. And obviously this session has been recorded, so we can revisit it, and it's also available for others. Thanks so much.
Thank you for chairing the session.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.